So to start out with, I just want to note that, prayer is so fundamental. I was thinking about it to really all faiths, not just the Christian faith, but I can't think of a religion or a spiritual tradition where there's not some sense of prayer that's really at the root of it. Several years ago when I lived in California, I was a part of a little interfaith community that would meet once a month and had the opportunity over the course of several months where we were talking about prayer to have priests and leaders and practitioners from different traditions come and share their prayer tradition with our group and teach us how to pray according to their tradition. And then we actually did it. And it was transformational. It was, once I kind of set aside some of my apprehensions, I distinctly remember the traditional Muslim prayer, where you face towards Mecca, and just the steps that a Muslim goes through in terms of the bowing and the symbolism that's in every single detail of that whole tradition that, of course, they do several times a day. And it's something that, to me, as coming up in the Christian tradition, it was a foreign, that's not something I had ever done before, but in doing it, it just made me, it was really holy. It was really special. And so anyway, it's just in reflecting on prayer and kind of some of the stuff that we've heard this month, it's not a Christian thing, obviously. It's an everybody thing. And it's very much at the center, I think, of all traditions. So I think Lynn said she looked up a definition. I also thought to look up a definition. So here are a couple definitions in Merriam-Webster of what is prayer. Prayer is an address, such as a petition to God or a God in word or thought. So an example is, he or she said a prayer for the success of the voyage. Another definition is an earnest request or wish. The act or practice of praying to God or a God, for example, kneeling in prayer. A religious service consisting chiefly of prayers. Something prayed for is a prayer. Something prayed for. And my favorite is the last one listed, which is a slight chance, as in he hasn't got a prayer. So it's impossible to define prayer, but at root, in thinking about kind of how I view it, I believe prayer is about communing and communicating with God or the divine, however we might describe or think of that. It is attentiveness to God. It is living with a present orientation toward God. It is every bit as much a life stance as it is actually saying words out loud. It is living in awareness of the presence. And in this sense, to the extent that we are present to the divine presence and action right now, we are all praying as we sit here and speak together. In the Christian tradition, there are a variety of forms and approaches to prayer. Of course, Jesus taught us what we now call the Lord's Prayer. He also modeled all sorts of prayer, both public and private, to his disciples. Paul tells the early church to pray without ceasing, which clearly implies a bigger definition of prayer than just speaking to God, because you couldn't do that without ceasing 24/7. Brother Lawrence speaks of prayer as practicing the presence of God, being attentive to God's presence in life and all things. Henry Nouwen, a theologian and author, calls prayer the only necessary thing, echoing Jesus' words about Mary when she sat at his feet. Writer Anne Lamott boils prayer down to 3 words: wow, thanks, and help. Many approaches to prayer in the Christian tradition: Lectio Divina, which is praying the scriptures, centering prayer, There are a range of prayer books and institutional church prayer practices. But I thought, for our discussion today, I'd like to open with a few questions. One is, what prayer practices resonate for you? Another is, what are your biggest questions and challenges with prayer? And then the third relates to kind of, is there anything, this month that our various speakers have shared about prayer that struck you one way or the other, that was memorable for you that you would like to talk about? So I guess let's start with, you can start with any one of those, but let's talk about prayer practices and things we've heard and learnings about prayer over this past month. Does anybody want to kick us off? Mary?
When I was small, I went to Catholic school, and we memorized prayers right and left. And so we learned prayer was something that you learned by rote and you repeated by rote, which didn't mean all that much. However, when I memorized the catechism that we had to learn questions and answers and so forth, the definition of prayer was the opening of our minds and hearts to God. And the spoken prayer didn't mean all that much to me when I was very young, perhaps a little more now, but the silence of what's between the words and just silent prayer, some call it centering prayer, but it could be more than that, has become much more meaningful to me. I feel more of a sense of settling in communion. The joy that I've had over the years is to go to silent retreats where you are with people, but you are completely silent, relating only through sound, through gesture perhaps if you need to, and reflecting on words that, whether they're sacred or considered not, that can bring you closeness and a sense of wholeness and a sense of openness that you can address what your concerns are to God. So, people have different views, words that you memorize, but also the having your minds open to accept what comes through the silence when you're trying to be open to God.
Beautiful. I've found that as I've my journey has been, when I was younger, it was much more of a just talking to God and asking for, a lot of it was, hey, here's my problem, or here's the challenge. And that's all good. Jesus said, ask and you shall receive. But as I've gotten older, I've found the sitting in silence to be much more meaningful in kind of how I meet God. So much so that I would say it's a challenge for me. So one of the questions is, what prayer challenges might you have? I have a challenge asking God for things because I almost feel, of course, God knows every hair of our head and what our needs are. We were also instructed to put those before the Lord, but sometimes I kind of feel like even in sick, very difficult situations, going beyond just praying for God's will to be done, I almost feel like I'm somehow being selfish by trying to ask for this thing to work the way I want it to work. And I'm not preaching that. I'm just saying that's my challenge, is that I need that balance of the words and the silence in between the words, as you so beautifully put it.
There's a great passage from Ecclesiastes about avoiding foolish prayer, which I think is really interesting and it's kind of worth thinking about, and I'll very quickly go through it. Watch your step when you enter God's house. Enter to learn. That's far better than mindlessly offering a sacrifice, doing more harm than good. Don't shoot off your mouth or speak before you think. Don't be too quick to tell God what you think he wants to hear. God's in charge, not you. The less you speak, the better. When you tell God you'll do something, do it now. God takes no pleasure in foolish drivel. Vow it, then do it. Far better not to vow in the first place than to vow and not pay up. This is obviously a modern translation. Don't let your mouth make a total sinner of you. When called to account, you won't get by with, sorry, I didn't mean it. Why risk provoking God to angry retaliation? But against all illusion and fantasy and empty talk, there's always this rock foundation, respect God. I think that's important because when we talk about learning prayers or praying by rote, that it's very easy for that to become a mindless exercise that you sort of throw off and do without any real meaning. And as I've said when I've preached about prayer here, I think it's better to think of God the way you thought of your high school friends when you called them on the phone in the evening and spoke for an hour about nothing. And I can't remember what any of those phone calls were about, but they were important. And I think you can do the same thing with God. You can have, I believe in conversational prayer that goes on throughout the day, and it covers affirmation and thanks and all those things. But I think if you worry too much about the form, then you end up worrying about the form as opposed to the meaning. And I think that applies whether you're a deep, faithful Christian, whether you believe that God is everywhere, or even if you view it as a philosophical school, it's still worthwhile. You don't have to be an evangelical. You don't have to expect to speak in tongues. You can still participate in a prayer existence with whatever higher power governs the world, and it can still be very helpful.
That makes a lot of sense. The whole idea of breath prayers and just kind of conversational kind of throughout the day. I like that. I don't do it. That's something I need to work on. Wayne?
Well, I was practically raised in prayer from the earliest I can remember. My mother, and then later my mother and stepfather, when I went to bed, they would pray along my bedside. And it's maybe a Lutheran thing. Probably other people pray it too with their children. It's, now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, pray the Lord my soul to take. And then we'd recite the Lord's Prayer. And then ask God to look after Grandma and Grandpa, and mention several family members. And every night that was it. And then before every meal, we would say a grace, inviting Jesus to be our guest, and thank Jesus for that blessing of the food. Family gatherings, we'd actually sing the grace. Be present at our table, Lord. And at the first church I can remember attending, the Zion Lutheran Church back in Rockford, they had two paintings of Jesus, representing Jesus on either side behind the altar. And one was Jesus, I'm guessing it was in the Garden of Gethsemane, kneeling at a rock, and a beam of light radiating down or up, who knows, on his face as he looked upwards. And I could remember as a kid, sometimes out driving at night with my folks, and you'd occasionally see a searchlight up in the sky, probably some auto dealership trying to attract people to their big sale on automobiles. But I'd fancy that was somebody praying, and that light beaming down or up. in the culture, oftentimes the times you'll see prayers when somebody's in desperate straits and there's nothing left to do but just get on your knees and pray to God. Probably everybody knows It's a Wonderful Life. There's other examples of that. And God doesn't always answer your prayer as you would expect. But God has the right answer for you if you look for it. And as far as this past month goes, I don't remember offhand the speaker, but it might have been Vi, I'm not sure. But it was love as acts of love. Her emphasis was, I think, on
that was Vi.
Not just the saying or thinking aspect of prayer, but actually doing stuff for people out of love as a form of prayer as well.
Thank you.
Diane Mason?
Yeah, go ahead, Diane.
Okay. For me, anytime I turn to the divine for whatever it is, for help, for surcease of pain and suffering, even though I can rationalize it to myself, I have always felt a sense of guilt, because whatever my pain or suffering might have been or is, I carry with I've been aware of the much greater suffering of other people, starving, you name it, being bombed, being tortured to death. So I can never dignify my own pain and suffering as being worthy of the attention of the divine, because I carry with it my sense of how much worse it is for other people. And that's always been, it's been a discomfort. And on the other hand, it's been a benefit. It's been a blessing. I'm happy that I carry that with me anytime I turn to the divine for myself. So it's one of those ironies that serves nevertheless. Thank you.
Thank you. We got one here, Edie, Diane, and then we'll come to you. Just a minute. Yeah, go ahead here.
Did you call my name, David?
I did.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, David, for thinking about this church and coming up with a theme like prayer and having us really put our thoughts to this and have a discussion. So what can I say? Well, in the first place, I'm sitting here in this beautiful Stuyvesant town, and I see love and prayer all around me. And I do not think of God as any particular gender. I look on it as a universal spirit. In terms of what we've heard this month, I know that on April 7th, we had a very interesting discussion when Jesus was in Gethsemane, and the interaction between Peter, his good friend, and then Thomas, and what it was like for Jesus at that time. And then other sermons have told us about the importance of persistence with prayer, and another one has told us that the important thing is whether you think you do it well or not. The important thing is to pray, and then to pray until something happens. And on a humorous note, when we pray, this universal spiritual God encourages us. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I heard once a while ago that prayer was a ritual to know God better, and that really resonated with me. And since then, prayer to me is really, it comes in stillness and observation and observing God's love every day. I do think a challenge of mine is having more conversational prayers. For some reason, when I am trying to have a conversational prayer, it makes me feel more separated, like I'm speaking to a separate entity than something that's one with me. And so the observation, I think, is how I feel most connected in my prayers with God. But I am trying to become more conversational, because I do think there's power in, like you mentioned, kind of asking as well, and having that awareness of speaking with God in that way.
Somebody else on Zoom? Oh,
Rob, ready?
Rob?
Yes, hi, good morning. I think for me, prayer has become just moments of awareness where no matter what I'm doing, whether it's, making eggs in the morning or taking a walk, practicing the piano, it's been sort of a goal of mine to have, and it's been referred to by others, the unspoken moments become prayers, and just something in addition to, asking for favors, so that my life in its entirety winds up being some type of a recognition, some type of a prayer, just to recognize God and say, look, even though I'm doing this mundane thing, I'm giving it to you as a prayer. Thanks.
Thank you. Wayne?
Yes, thank you. I meant to continue with that thought about being raised in prayer with my mother, and then later my mother and stepdad. And more recently, I had visiting my sister Jody, had the experience of her praying with her two daughters, and the exact same prayer, and then saying the Lord's Prayer, and then remembering, family, remembering Uncle Wayne, and hearing my name being prayed over by my nieces was extraordinary. One other thing that's persisted with me throughout the years as a form of prayer is confession. Maybe it's those of you familiar with Lake Wobegon, guilt is a very prevalent thing amongst Scandinavian Lutherans. And that was a big deal to us. And so a big portion of prayer was just to get a load off your chest, confessing everything you did wrong that day or you could have done better. And that's enough. Thank you.
I think that idea of confession is a good one, because it's kind of a word, it's kind of an old-fashioned word, and maybe not as popular to think of today. And it can be it can obviously be too extreme if we're living in this constant sense of, less thanness or whatever. But, I think the Lord's Prayer, where it's Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name, is that it's coming prostrate before the divine and saying, you're holy, I'm here, and I need to get in the right, this is a relationship, and I'm not all that. And so to me, there's like a fundamental sense of confession, and whenever I do incorporate any little bit of that, it opens up the heart in a way where it's like, you get this stuff out, and then you can actually, have that conversation, if you will. But, Reverend Joe?
For those of you who are scripture-oriented for guidance, the Apostle Paul, who wasn't really a very warm and fuzzy guy, did in Philippians, in counseling people about praying, very interesting for what we're talking about now and what Diane Mason was saying. So, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. So he was really saying that there is no request that's too small or trivial, but they should go with thanksgiving, and they should go with supplication and recognizing God's authority and power in the world, but that you shouldn't be afraid to ask. And I think that that's important, because there's nothing you shouldn't ask for. I still think praying to win the lottery is not a good bet, but nonetheless, there's nothing that you shouldn't ask for, because God answers prayers, sometimes unspoken, sometimes spoken, but he answers mostly what you ask about, even if the answers aren't always the answer you want. So I think that's important, that there are different types of prayer, and from conversational to memorized to all others, but that any kind of prayer can be good for you and for God, and it's a two-way street.
Thank you. You just stole my benediction, which was the Philippians. Well, I know I don't actually have my watch with me, but I imagine we're about out of time. Lynn has her hand up. Lynn, you will have the last word. Take us home.
I'm sitting here, and I was brought up in the Lutheran Church. Every Sunday, I was in Luther League. I was in the choir. I sang solos. I went to Lutheran retreats. And when I moved to New York, I went to one church after another and was so disillusioned. But over the years, and I'm 82, and I assure you, I have researched every church, I've read everything, and I am one of definitely uncertain faith. I sit here, I listen, and I say, it's like new information, because I don't pray. I try to live, for example, I like to live the 10 Commandments. I really think, do unto others. So I do that. I believe I'm not a Christian, but I believe I live a Christian life as I understand it. But boy, I sit in church and I listen to sermons, and and believe me, I wish I was devout, because it seems nice to be able to turn yourself over to someone else for help. And I do it all myself. I've done extraordinary amounts of personal work and therapy and all sorts of things. And I'm happy I'm getting to where I want to be as a person, thank goodness, at 82. But I just have to say, the reason I'm here, though, is this kind of conversation. But it's mostly this community. So I think that's just it. I just said to myself, I was saying to myself in preparing, because I did do some research to see how I felt. And I said, how does a person of uncertain faith pray? And what came to me, the closest thing is meditation, as I understand prayer. Just this kind of peacefulness and quiet, the silence, because it's so hard to turn off our brains. It's so hard, that so-called little voice in the back of our heads, to turn it off and just relax into being. So, but it's so interesting. It's just lovely to hear. And remembering, Wayne reminds me of my childhood. We said prayers before dinner at Thanksgiving and Christmas, and of course in church. And of course, you have to know my mother was a phenomenal cook, and she used to cater all the dinners at church. She used to cook for everybody, so you can imagine where I was. But anyway, I just love this church. Something is happening to me here. I am falling in love with Chelsea Church. People that I have cared about, all of a sudden, the word love is very real for me. So, and I love seeing, and dear Diana, who's so proactive about, she was at a seminar with Al Gore, for goodness sakes. That just is so impressive. And dear Sandra, And if I'd known you were here, I would have brought pistachios. But anyway, so thank you all. I love it here. David, I thank you so much for bringing us together. And I would love to see more of occasions like this, not just about prayer and maybe not just about church, but you know, St. Peter's has enormous events just discussing issues, not church and not everything. So I would like that to happen. And thank you all very much.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you all for participating in this, coming up, having the discussion. I think, you know, we see that there's no right or wrong way to pray, right? And we've seen it through our speakers and through just our conversation here. But it is a journey I would encourage us all to move into and to continue to move into, just because we see, regardless of where we are in the faith spectrum, prayer is fundamental and has been throughout history for humankind. And I think all of us, in one way or another, have seen the impact of prayer in our lives. So anyway, I've been blessed by this discussion. I appreciate all you guys taking part in it. And certainly we can continue it in our refreshment time afterwards. But thanks to you guys on Zoom as well.